I've done it. I have accomplished what I set out to do. I've completed Rhythm of War before the new year, and boy, do I have a lot to say about it. There's certainly much more that I'm going to be able to fit into this video. I've already got some ideas churning in my head for the rest of the videos that are going to be coming up after this, but as it is with every book that I read, we're going to do this quick review first. I'll start with a spoiler-free portion, and then afterwards we can dive into some spoilerific specifics. I love this book. It's potentially my favorite in the Stormlight Archive. Because I read it so recently, it's going to be really hard for me to make that hard decision until later, possibly after I even reread it. But right now, this was the best experience I had the first time reading through one of these books, and I'm not sure if it's because I'm already so connected to these characters, or if it's because this book is genuinely my favorite. In the first few chapters, I was very worried about the way that pacing could potentially go in this book. There were certain points that showed me what I was expecting the plot to go like, and for the most part, I don't like the plot archetypes that they had set up. They're normally really slow and frustrating, and I just don't enjoy them. But this book ends up doing them extremely well. It honestly made me rethink if I didn't like those plot archetypes, or if I just don't like the way that those plot archetypes are normally executed. Whereas Brandon goes, this is the way to do it, and he really shows you a good way of using these plot archetypes while still telling an amazing story that you want to keep reading. So all in all, I ultimately liked the pacing of this book. I know a lot of people felt like this book was a little too long, but I didn't feel that at all. But the way that he chooses to organize this plot does make it seem a little bit weird and different from the other books, and I think it works out really well, but I could totally see some people not liking how this book plays out. What I did have a problem with, however, were the flashback scenes. Now, for all 4 books, I'm about 50-50 on the flashback scenes. I really liked Kaladin and Dalinar's, and Shallan and Venli's always left me going, no, wait, I really want to know what's going on in the present right now. This isn't really that interesting. And that isn't to say I didn't like reading more about Venli and Eshonai and the listeners as a whole, but it always felt like it was cutting away from more important plots that I needed to get to. But I don't think it really pulls away from the book all that much, because we're only ever really getting a flashback chapter every few chapters. But let's talk about something that Brandon Sanderson has been toying around with for a while, but he's finally decided to hammer it home more, and boy, he's really hit the sphere out of the storm or something like that. I have not read this good of a representation of mental health in a high fantasy book, I think, ever. That representation is good because it's not just focusing on a single person or a single problem. It affects a lot of people, and it affects them differently, and we see that in these characters. And it's clear that Brandon Sanderson has done his research and talked to people who've experienced these things, because some of these chapters were really hard to read because of how just true emotionally they felt to me. I'll talk about that a bit more in the spoilery section. It's always hard to talk about a 4th book in a spoiler-free talk, isn't it? His writing has only improved since the beginning, so if you liked the writing before, you're gonna like it now. And I do really think that Brandon has hit his stride in pacing, and this book just kind of flows all the way through without any real major hiccups, despite this really weird format of him kind of choosing a main single story with a few side stories, whereas in previous books, you kind of had stories that were all weaving until they came together at the end. I think he does a really good job of introducing new problems and new characters without feeling like he's sliding them in at the last second right before the final book. This book feels thought out and meticulous. It gives us so much information on the Cosmere as a whole. It does an amazing job setting up the future for Stormlight Archive. And while all of that's happening, we get amazing character moments in this book with strong emotion and deep character exploration. I mean, I cried. You'll cry. I know it. But yes, I love it. I'm gonna give it 9 pieces of 8. Now, let's move into some more spoilery specifics about this book. Some goods, some bads. All spoilers though. So pause this. If you haven't read it, go read Rhythm of War, and I'll see you in like a couple of weeks or something. It's a lot. Let's talk general structure first. I think that the structure of this book is really well done, especially for how much we're focusing on this Urithiru plot. This is kind of the single driving plot of the book, while you have these 2 subplots of Yasna and Dalinar pushing into Emil, and then you have Adolin and Shallan going to meet the Honor Sprint in Shadesmar, and then you have Urithiru with Kaladin and Devani as your main 2 characters of this book. I suppose you could also bunch in Venli with them, but she's kind of off doing her own thing, but she's still a part of the Urithiru plot, yeah. I was really ready to dislike the pacing for 2 out of 3 of these plots. The Adolin and Shallan arc, as well as the Kaladin Devani arc, were 2 plot lines that I normally hate. The Adolin arc is a prison arc where you're locked up, and normally everyone's arguing against you in bad faith, and it's something that tends to really tilt me, because I just know that the right thing has to happen, and normally the character's just waiting for it. But here we didn't really sit with it for a long time. I think removing Shallan and Adolin from a big section of the book in part 2 or 3, I don't remember which one, was a good choice. I think we got enough of Shadesmar beforehand, and then for it to land on him going to have this court decision, and then for a big big gap for us to focus more on Urithiru and Venli, I think that was a really good choice. We got to see his struggles in the courtroom. We got to see that the Honor Spren are not only arguing in bad faith, but are still fallible. And then this all builds up to the "we chose" line from Maya. I feel like that made all of the court so worth it. I feel like it really reinforced Adolin being his own person, despite some people not liking this Adolin character arc. He's trying to lead differently. He's trying to care about people a bit more than we see Dalinar care. But Adolin has some of my favorite scenes in this book. All of his court scenes are really good. His scenes with Shallan are really cute. And that scene where he defends Notam, I think is one of the best scenes in this entire book. I'm honestly a little upset that not a lot of people talk about this scene. I think it's because it's really early in the book, and then so much more happens that it's really hard to remember that this occurred. But it's a really cool scene, showcasing Adolin alone, underpowered, but in his element, and just being really, really awesome. I think that was important for his character growth in our eyes as readers, because he's been a bit mopey, with good reason, but you know, he's not as superpowered as the Radiants. He's not able to find out how to be his own man against his dad, and being the best duelist in town just don't have that same shine to it as it used to. So putting him in a situation like this and showing that no, Adolin is still Adolin really felt good. This whole arc also really felt like it was building up to some Deus Ex Machina, with everyone telling Adolin that there's absolutely no way that this is going to be solvable. But we have this more subtle Maya arc building. We're clearly seeing her getting better. And so for the Deus Ex Machina, you could call it, of this huge revelation of information that came to the rescue for Adolin, ended up feeling way more like a payoff for Maya's arc than that we were cheated out of a real outcome for this one. And so I really think that despite us not getting a huge page count with Adolin and Shallan, Adolin's main story here was really good. And I liked Shallan's as well. I don't want to talk about it here just because there's a lot of Ghost Bloods and more major Cosmere stuff, and I'll just keep talking and talking. So I'm going to save her arc for a different video, but rest assured that I really like that arc as well. And we'll talk about some hard reads that I had on it later. The Kaladin arc, when they were setting it up, was the one that I was least looking forward to. Not only is it a D-power arc for our coolest superhero, but it's also the one where they have to act under the rule of the enemy and be all stealthy and sleuthy. It's not fun to me. However, I think I've changed my mind on it. I think the way that Brandon Sanderson did it here with Kaladin was really good. And I think a big portion of that was because the focus wasn't mainly on Kaladin. Yeah, we got like really important scenes with him where he got to be really cool despite the lack of powers, where he was really struggling in these moments. But the focus was on Navani. The focus was on this chess science research game between Navani and Raboniel. And I think that's what really paid off. I think it's what allowed this storyline to take up as much of the book as it did, while still having momentum and keeping you wanting to continue reading. Because this plot arc that normally ends with a decision or an action that has to be made, but they could have made it way earlier, isn't what's happening here. We're constantly getting new information. The story is constantly growing from Navani's point of view, and then that all builds to the final conclusion of Navani bonding the sibling and Kaladin being able to do what he has to do. And some might say that the sibling could have bonded someone earlier, and that's the decision that we were all waiting to happen, but I don't think that's true. I think Navani had to do a lot of character learning, as well as have that perspective shift working with Raboniel. And this is also really good because we were getting a lot more information on kind of the more political workings of the Fused, and we got to see a lot of those interactions through Venli and Raboniel and Leshwi. All of that was really interesting. Like Raboniel, who I was ready to hate. I was ready for her to just be very 1D, very just evil, and I just want to do research. But I ended up really liking that character. She's obviously a little crazy. She's a really good representation of a villain that really believes they're doing the right thing. And then we had Venli, who really grew on me in this book. She's that reluctant hero. She doesn't know immediately or innately what's right and what's wrong. And she's also not always going to choose to do the right thing, or she might wait to do the right thing because she's looking out for herself. And I think that's a really good fresh take on one of the newer heroes in Stormlight, after we got Kaladin and Dalinar and Yasna all knowing what they have to do and then immediately jumping to action and doing it. But like I said in the spoiler-free portion, I found her present day point of views really interesting because she's struggling with moral quandaries, whereas in the flashback she was just being tricked by a spren. I loved the aspects of the culture that we got and more interactions with Eshonai and some of the Cosmere implications of these flashbacks, as well as the more minor story of their mom suffering from crab dementia. But it just constantly feels like it's a hiccup in the story, like Kaladin's about to do something and then Eshonai's got to go off into the woods and draw a map. Especially because all these events happened a few years ago, but recent enough to where we kind of know what happened. We even get scenes from scenes that we've seen. Yeah. However, that chapter where the Stormfather shows Eshonai mercy is beautiful. It was so touching, and you know, I cried again. I know. And it made me feel so much worse that we're not going to see more of Eshonai in any of these books. It really sucks because Eshonai was really cool, but I'm glad that she got such a send-off scene for her. The Dalinar plotline was fine for what we saw of it. I think it was actually really more of a Yasna plotline, to be fair, with her being on the front lines confronting the enemy, and her and Wit concocting plans, and her arguments with Dalinar about pushing more of a democratic rule. All of these scenes were really good, and I think all these scenes were really powerful and really strong because they were the only scenes of this arc that we saw. They were all fighting battles and fighting that war and pushing into Emil, but we didn't have to see it. We've seen 3 full books of war. We got to see a new perspective on it. We got to see Yasna doing all of this and reacting to all of this for the first time as queen. And so when we get it from her perspective, it's extremely interesting, and it shows us that there's progress being made there, but we don't have to spend a lot of time with it. We know what's going on here, and we get some great new LGBT rep here. The way that Yasna describes her emotions and her outlook on sexuality is clearly meant to be asexual. I think even Brandon has confirmed it after the fact, but just reading her descriptions when she's with Wit feels really well done. We can chalk another one up to a great representation in the Stormlight Archive. Now, let's start talking about mental health. The representation in this book is killer. Kaladin, with his PTSD and his depression and anxiety crippling him, but he's still forced to keep going. He still has to be John McClane in Die Hard while having PTSD flashback and being frozen with fear. The scene where he's walking through Urithiru after Dalinar tells him that he can't fight anymore was one of the hardest scenes that I've had to read in a book. I was scared for Kaladin in those moments because the way that Brandon Sanderson was able to write that scene with such great representation of how those moments really feel when you're suffering through what I like to call the big sad. And then for Adolin to come in and save the day, forcing Kaladin to go to that bar, I think having that happen was more important than seeing the scenes of Kaladin really going through it. Kaladin even acknowledges how important those actions were to him later on, because someone who doesn't have this crippling depression that Kaladin has, for someone to not experience depression then read this book and see the representation of Adolin doing that for his friend can be helpful in a way that might feel so incredibly small. Being a good friend to someone sometimes is forcing them to do something. Not all the time. Don't be a shitty friend, but having someone that'll go, nope, I'm not gonna listen to you. I'm just gonna hang out here. We're gonna sit next to each other. You don't have to talk, but I'm still gonna be here, is an important friend to have. And I really appreciated seeing that in this book, especially because I love Kaladin and Adolin. I think they're the best big two idiots. I love them. They're like big golden retrievers who, one's really sad all the time, but the other one makes up for it with his happiness. I also think that it was made clear in this book that Brandon Sanderson has officially decided that Shallan is experiencing dissociative identity disorder. You can see it solely through the terminology he uses and the way the 3 personalities are portrayed throughout this book. I think it's really well done, and once again, the better thing is how a lot of people that are close to her react, and the way that we can see that representation of how you should react around someone like this, treating her like a normal person. Navani and Adolin also go through their own struggles with mental health in this book. Navani with her imposter syndrome, and Adolin dealing with the expectations of his dad and what person he needs to become moving forward. And I think that the varying levels of mental health representation in this book are also really important. Brandon shows you that not everyone has to be mentally crippled by the viciousness of war or literally kill your own mom to have a mental illness and be valid in those problems. We just can look at Navani and think that she's stupid for believing that she's not a scholar after everything that she's been able to do. But there are actual people with actual PhDs that have this same exact problem. And so for some, that might seem like something that's pretty silly. This is amazing for other readers, and I think that that's great. Even Yasna got to see what real war was like. She showcases that you can't be strong all the time, and that was amazing. But moving on a bit from that, I just want to take a moment. I just want to flex a moment for how hard some of my reads were. Like, I have DMs dated properly to show how early I made these reads. And I also live tweet about them at Laxxia, so if you want to just follow me and see what I talk about when I read books, you can see it there. It's really cool. I have a lot of hot takes. But Todium, the Frog King himself, killing Rays and taking his spot as a shard. I had that read around the first interlude with Taravangian. And that's not a bad thing. That doesn't make it predictable. I think Brandon has set up Taravangian's plot incredibly well as a foil to Dalinar. It's someone who is willing to do the worst that mankind will ever see because he is the king and he has to lay himself down on the line for the betterment of his people. And so it kind of makes sense when you extrapolate that plot out to where we got to at Oathbringer, and then you kind of see more of that hammered home in a lot of his rhetoric in the first point of view that you get from him in this book. And yeah, he's gonna become the Shard of Odium. And my other hard read is on some super meta knowledge of the Cosmere as a whole, and I haven't even read Mistborn yet. I do know, however, who Kelsier is. And so when Mraize talks to Shallan really early in this book, he mentions a lot about they need to get the Stormlight off this planet, they need to figure out how they can get cognitive shadows out of their realm of influence in the cognitive realm of the planet. I almost instantly texted my friend and said, hey, Kelsier's Thetacar, isn't he? And then I had to have that friend confirm later because I didn't know what a Lord of Scars was. But boom. And even before the book came out, go check it. I got it in a video. Navani bonds the sibling. Boom. I don't want this little section of my video to be like, haha, look how big my brain is, even though I'm still hyped that I was right about all these things. It's more to express how well that Brandon Sanderson has written these characters and this story, so we're able to see these things and deduce what logically should happen next with how good his writing is. There was obviously a ton in this book, and I plan on talking about way more of it in other videos coming up real soon. The epigraphs, the ghost bloods, that epilogue with Hoyd, oh my god. This is all super critical to the Cosmere as a whole, but not super critical to my quick review. So I'm gonna leave all those great little snackums out for the next meal. And you bet, while you're watching this video, I'm already hard at work with my yarn and my thumbtacks figuring out just what all of it means. But that's what we got for this review. I loved this book. I hope you loved this book. If you didn't, tell me what your favorite book of the Stormlight Archive is. And if you liked what I had to say here, if you found it interesting even, hit me with that like button. And if you haven't yet, hit me with that subscribe button. Thank you so much for watching. I'll catch you next time. And until then, stay lit.